Well, good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us in another one of our Livestock Guardian Dog webinars. We do these quarterly. It's usually on the third Thursday at 3 o'clock each time. So thank you for joining in. I do want to thank our sponsors today, Lone Star Tracking. If you're looking for any type of GPS trackers, feel free to reach out to Lone Star Tracking. They can get you set up with the same units that we use. Also, Spot On Fence. If you're looking for, some sort of an invisible fence system to help you keep your guard dogs, on the property or stop them from roaming a little bit, reach out to Hannah there at Spot On Fence, and she can get you taken care of with those. Also, the Sheep and Goat Predator Management Board for providing funding for our program. It is a joint program between Texas A&M AgriLife and the Sheep and Goat Predator Board. So if you're in the checkoff region, we do appreciate your support of paying that checkoff fund each time you sell a sheep or goat. Just remind everybody, if you've got questions, please post those into the chat. We will get to all those at the end of the webinar today. So with us, we have Dr. Julie Young. She's an associate professor at Utah State University, whose research focuses on the behavior, ecology, and management of carnivores and beavers. Her research aims to reduce negative human-wildlife interactions to facilitate coexistence. She often co-produces research with livestock producers to increase the efficacy of non-lethal tools such as livestock guardian dogs that help reduce livestock depredation. So with that, Dr. Young, I will turn it over to you. And I sure do appreciate you taking some time. And I'm pretty excited, as I mentioned earlier, to have you present for us today. So thank you, ma'am.
Well, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And thank you all that are here right now live, or if you're watching this later on a recording. I really appreciate people's interest in this topic and hope that I can give you a little bit of information that might be helpful. I'm going to share my screen here. Is that good?
Yes, ma'am, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, so I'm Julie. I'm at Utah State University, and I've done a bit of research on livestock guardian dogs, and I'm going to talk mainly about two studies today, because what I think of is that we know a lot about research. We know a lot about livestock guardian dogs. A lot of you are already using livestock guardian dogs, and a lot of times you have questions about them. And as a scientist, my goal is always to figure out through research how to make sure that we evaluate their effectiveness. How we make sure that they're doing the best job they can do for you to protect the livestock and to not harm wildlife while they're doing it. While we want them to keep the carnivores out of the herd, we also don't want them to be harassing, for instance, some of the native deer and other ungulates out there and causing havoc, and also being distracted by that when they should be guarding your herd. So the research I'm going to present today is basically scientific evaluations of the effectiveness of livestock guardian dogs. And we measured effectiveness in several different ways. And I'm going to go through them through the two projects I'm going to talk about, define effectiveness for each. So for the first project I'm going to talk about, we basically were looking at these four questions to look at effectiveness. First was, does sheep survival vary by the breed of livestock guardian dog and the predator species that they're encountering? So a lot of times we'd hear from producers, I had these dogs. Wildlife Services, for instance, was very involved in the research back in the 80s and 90s. And that was when there were mostly coyotes on the landscape. And now there's these larger carnivores out there. There's a lot more wolves and grizzly bears out there. And what do I do? These dogs don't seem to be working. So we looked at whether it was a breed difference or something else going on. So we looked at it from a couple of these perspectives. First is just how these breeds did as far as sheep survival. Second was, do different breeds behave differently? So is it more a case of just how they're behaving, and are there things that we can learn about that? Third was, how do the carnivores respond to the livestock guardian dogs? So is it a case of these carnivores maybe just behaving in different ways than these guard dogs had been used to in the past? And then last was whether or not having LGDs affects the tolerance of people for having wolves and grizzly bears on the landscape. So I know this talk, I'm giving it to Texas A&M AgriLife is hosting this, so you might not be thinking about wolves and grizzly bears where you are, but this is obviously a huge issue out throughout most of the Western United States. So, the first question again is, oh, sorry, and then I'm going to leap into the second project is whether or not LGDs worked for Farmstead. So this is a very different scenario where you have things like grain spillage attracting carnivores, especially omnivores like grizzly bears, to farmsteads. And so I'll get into that in a minute. But let's go back to this first project and this first question. How does sheep survival vary, or does it, with different breeds of LGDs, and does that survival vary by the predator that the sheep are encountering? So what we did is we basically set up an experimental design. It was somewhat quasi-experimental because obviously folks that already had dogs, guardian dogs, we kind of lumped them all together as white dogs. This was a lot of Pyrenees, Akbash, or some sort of hybrid cross between some of those species that people already had in a lot of our Western states. And what we did is lump those as kind of our control, white dogs. And then we imported 3 breeds from other countries. Now there's 30 breeds of livestock guardian dogs around the world, 30 to 33 breeds, depending on how you split them. And so what we did is we looked at all of those breeds and first just eliminated any that we were going to have trouble importing to the United States. And second, any that weren't necessarily that different from the white dogs that were currently being used in the United States. And what we came down with was a list of about 5 to 6 breeds. And from there, again, it just became a logistical issues of which ones we could get shipped to the United States. And we ended up with these 3 breeds to test. So if I go clockwise from the top left corner, that black and white dog is called a Transmontano. It's out of Portugal, and it works there. It's one of the more ancient. These are all very ancient breeds that we're testing as well. And so it's a large kind of rangy dog that's really popular and one of their primary dogs for guardian dogs in Portugal. Then the next one, the one with the big tag on its collar, is a Congo, and these are out of Turkey. And so we worked with actually a person in Dallas and a researcher in Turkey to get these imported. It's a very large dog, also an ancient breed. And the most closely related one in the US already was the Akbash. And then of course in that bottom right corner is a white dog. And then to the left, the last corner is a Karakachan. And this is a breed out of Bulgaria. And we were able to ship from a livestock guardian dog breeding facility in Bulgaria directly to the United States. And these dogs are a little bit stockier in build, so they're a little shorter than the Transmontano and the Congo, but they're equally as heavy, so kind of a stocky dog, and they come in a lot more variety of colors. So these were the 4 groups of livestock breeds that we basically considered. And then we placed them with ranches all throughout the 5 kind of Northwest states in the US. So some of these were already had their dogs and served as our controls with the white dogs. Others, we gave them up to 3 dogs of the same breed, so to work with their sheep. So we were working entirely with sheep herds that graze, almost all of them graze in open allotments where they have the summer grazing season where they go out on national forest land or other public lands and then move across the landscape throughout the summer grazing season and then only bring them into fenced pastures for the winter. A few of these did have more of a fenced pasture system, more commonly seen in places like Texas. Especially in Montana, we worked with a few Hutterite colonies, and that's their system where they had multiple pastures that they moved the animals between. So what we did then is we collected a lot of different different data on these dogs, and we did this over 3 different grazing summer seasons, along with some baseline data throughout the winter. And we first of all collected data on behavior. So this was actually us observing the dogs live or through experimental manipulations. I'll explain in a minute. We looked at space use. So all of the dogs were fitted with GPS collars. And then some of the sheep were fitted. You can see the sheep's wearing one of our GPS tags so that we could look at association between the 2. We, of course, measured mortality of the sheep. And so the livestock producers were all kindly giving us data at the end of each grazing season, as well as any confirmed or suspected depredation events. And then we looked at, oh, space use is on there twice. Sorry about that. And then we also looked at attitudes and tolerance. And so for this, space use, the second space use should say space use of wildlife, and that we had a series of camera traps out. I don't know why wildlife got erased. And we had a series of camera traps out where we would monitor before the sheep herd moved through an area. leave them there during the time the sheep herd with the dogs and people were in the area, and then continue to monitor after they left the area to look at space use of the predators on the landscape as well as native prey species. And then last, we did these surveys with the people that own livestock guardian dogs on attitudes and tolerance towards large carnivores. So again, the first question is, which LGD is best for which predator? And the way we looked at this, again, is just a lot of survival data from these different herds. And what we found is that in comparison to the white dogs, or control group, the dogs that were already living on the landscape, the imported breeds collectively showed each breed showed anywhere from a 61 to 95% reduction in sheep depredation. So this was a significant drop in that less sheep were getting killed by carnivores in herds with these imported breeds. And this was kind of interesting because in a lot of cases, we were shipping dogs when they were 6 weeks old or 8 weeks old, whenever they basically had been weaned. The oldest ones I think we got were less than a year old, whereas a lot of the white dogs were already well established, been with the herd for a couple of years. Usually not too old, but usually in that prime age group. So this was really interesting to see as our dogs went from about 1 to 3 years old, they still had this great reduction in sheep depredation. So basically, this means that these breeds sort of, in a way, outperform the traditional white dogs used in the US. When we look at specific breeds, interestingly, the Congol's did really well in reducing depredation by cougars, black bears, and coyotes. And these things were all statistically significant in that they really showed a powerful impact on these specific species especially compared to the white dogs. So if you're in an area where these are your primary predators, you might want to consider getting a Congo. The Karakachan was by far, even better than the Congo, the best against coyotes. And so if your primary predator is still a coyote, a Karakachan might be the right dog for you. And so this was really interesting. The Transmontano didn't have anything that showed specific to a specific predator as outperforming the rest. It just was collectively better than the white dogs all around. So again, just to kind of wrap that part up, which LGD is best for which predator? Well, all of these imported breeds were better than our white dogs at protecting sheep from depredation, but specifically the Congos might be the best choice in areas with cougars, black bears, and coyotes. The Karakachans are definitely the best choice for coyotes, and the Transmontano are just good if you just want an all-around good dog. So, and again, this isn't saying the white dogs aren't good. It's just saying that these dogs were able to outperform them in relation to effectiveness of sheep survival. All right, and this has been published already, and I will send these. I was talking to Ben before this started, and I'll send him all these papers so that they can be added to the library that the website keeps. But if you want to read the details or about the statistical methods we used or anything else, you can read that here. All right, so the next question we asked was whether or not LGD's breeds behave differently. We wanted to know, why are they performing differently when it comes to sheep survival? And we did this in a number of ways. One is we just sat out there and actually watched the dogs. And that's great for observational data. But then second, we use this experimental approach where, and I know it's kind of hard to see in this image, but we put out a wolf decoy. Now this one, you can see we basically had a real fur. We bought real furs of wolves. We stuffed them and kind of put them on these PVC pipes, and usually then put enough vegetation around so you can't see the PVC pipes. This is just for photo purposes. We then would set up remote cameras to observe things real close to the wolf. And then we would go sit on a hill far away with our spotting scope. Once we were set up, we also had a howl box at the site. And so we would, once we were set up, so this was away from the band of sheep with the producer or with a herder and the guardian dogs, because we didn't want them to detect us before we were finished setting up. Then we would walk up, set up at our observation point, and then we would call in the dogs basically by using a wolf howl on the howl box. And then we would record the behavior of the dogs as they approach this. For a control, we set up the exact same way, but instead of using a wolf and a wolf call, we would use a stuffed deer from a deer pelt. And unfortunately, the howl box, there's no deer calls, but there was an elk bugling. So we use that as our control. And so we could actually look at how the different breeds were responding to the immediate presence of a predator near the herd. using this and make sure that they were actually responding to it. And it wasn't just because there's this weird PVC thing on the landscape by using that control. And this is basically what we found. Behaviorally, most of the guardian dogs, at least when we just did that general behavior observation where we sat out and watched them, they're all behaving rather similarly. But what we found is when we had this kind of presence of a wolf, we found a few slight differences. The big ones being that Karakachans were more vigilant. So they were the ones that spent the most time looking around once they thought a predator was present. The Congos were the most likely to investigate. So they were the ones that would approach the most, sniff around the area, figure out what was actually at the site of where they thought there might be a threat. And then the Transmontanos, it was interesting because they showed some of the most distinct differences between how they reacted to the control and the treatment. So we kind of consider that they were the best at assessing a threat and what really needs to be responded to versus what they can kind of just chill out and ignore. It was interesting because some of our ranchers that had the Transmontanos would be like, they're kind of lazy dogs. And so I think if they don't think it's a threat, they're just not responding. But when it is a threat, they were definitely on it. And again, if you want to learn more about the details, I'm kind of blowing through these to give this 30,000 foot, view of what we learned on this study. But you can read all of the details there, and I'm happy, again, this will be on the library, or I can send it to folks or talk about it further during the questions. All right, so our third question in this part of this project was, how do carnivores respond to the LGDs? And so basically, our idea is that domestic sheep are pretty vulnerable prey, right? We haven't really bred them to be very defensive against carnivores. But the idea of sheep with a LGD is basically the equivalent of a defended prey. And so maybe it's in this case, and so we wanted to know in this case, when these prey are defended, does that keep the carnivores away? Or is it the carnivores are always trying and they're just getting out bested, as you might say, by the LGDs, that the LGDs are actually actively having to always defend. And so, of course, we can't separate the sheep from the guardian dog because they were always together. So we kind of consider this a herd level effect when we measured this. But basically what we would do is we put out these camera traps. And here's just an example of two of the transient paths that the sheep would take in one summer. So this is two different herds. They just happen to fall nicely on the same map in central Idaho. And you can see that they move across the landscape throughout the grazing season. And each green dot is where we put up cameras. And these cameras were put up before the sheep went out based on consultation with the ranchers to make sure that we hit areas that they would be grazing. And then we left them there until during the time the herd was there and then after as well. You can see the GPS points of dogs and sheep on this landscape on top of it. So we did a pretty good job of making sure that we had cameras in the areas that these sheep were. And we did this again. This was the first year, this example here, but we did this all 3 years. And then we would get through camera traps presence of the different carnivores and also native prey in the area. And so basically from that, you can then look at your probability of detecting different species. How often did you see these species on camera? It's a fancy way of saying that. And what we found is that there was a 50% reduction in the detection of large carnivores during the time the sheep herd was there being protected and also for several weeks after they left the area. And this is relative to before. So you have these cameras set up for several weeks before the sheep show up, and there was a 50% reduction in large carnivore presence. Interestingly, coyotes went up in detection during this time. So during the time the sheep herd was there, we were 3 times more likely to detect coyotes. And then after the sheep left, we were 2 times more likely. So this was kind of an interesting and contrary result. But remember from question number 1 of this project, sheep depredation still didn't increase, especially by coyotes. from having these livestock guardian dogs out there. So it's well, I'll talk about that in the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm so excited about that. Okay. And then interestingly, of all of the native wildlife, the one thing we saw was during the time the sheep ban was there was this 50% reduction in deer. Now, we did talk to the shepherds that were out with the dogs and the sheep, and they don't think that this was in response to like the guardian dogs necessarily harassing the deer. They didn't see that happen. So what we think this might be is just that presence of a large herd of animals grazing on things that deer might also want to graze on, might just make the deer decide to go somewhere else for a short period of time. Luckily, the deer did come back after the sheep herd left. And we didn't see anything for any other native prey. So what we think is probably happening is what we're saying, this probability of detection is actually just measuring that specific patch use, that area where the sheep are at a certain time. And so it may be that this moving of large carnivores, the wolves and the grizzly bears, away during the time the sheep are there with the guardian dogs and immediately afterwards may just be related to like a presence. The wolves may say, well, this is suddenly a defended prey is too hard to eat and I can just go somewhere else in my territory and eat this. But the reason we think we might not have seen this with coyotes is because, as you know, coyotes have a much smaller home range than a wolf, and they may not have that opportunity to move somewhere else. And so they may just be trying to take advantage of a situation. And so we think the guardian dogs are working to protect the sheep from coyotes through actual active defense behaviors. We weren't necessarily able to measure this. We had hoped to see more interactions between guardian dogs and predators, but that did not happen during our study. So that's just our hypothesis on, we think they're keeping wolves and grizzly bears out of the area through this just kind of defended prey. I'll go somewhere else where it might be easier to eat something else within my territory, but coyotes, that's their whole territory probably. And so they might just be continuing to push the boundaries and try again. And so the guardian dogs are probably more actively defending the sheep from coyotes than they have to from other predators. And again, this paper has been published, so that will be on the library as well, if you want to read more about it. And then the last question from this project was just whether or not having LGDs, and especially when they're working effectively, changes the tolerance that livestock producers might have for wolves and grizzly bears on the landscape. And so we did this just through a survey of LGD owners. Some of you on this call might have filled that out for us several years ago. We didn't limit it just to our producers on our study or even within the states we were working in. So we did end up getting some surveys from elsewhere, but we were able to control for where they were and what predators existed in our analysis. And this is one of our producers. This was a newspaper article, so I could put his face up here because it was from that, but a producer in Idaho. Okay, so from that survey, what we learned is that people had really positive things to say about their use of LGDs. They said that they reduced the need for lethal control, so they considered it more of a proactive instead of a reactive step, in reducing the need of a reactive step. And they also pointed out something that I was kind of surprised on, that they thought they reduced the disease transmission risks between native carnivores and their livestock, or even other native wildlife and their livestock. So these are pretty positive outcomes of having LGDs on the landscape. But interestingly, the longer someone had LGDs, the more negative their attitudes were towards grizzly bears on the landscape. And so we don't know exactly, we couldn't quite decipher why that was. We have some hypotheses that maybe it's just, it can be pretty frustrating to have grizzly bears out there when you're trying to make a living off livestock and for years and years of having to deal with it. And so even though it might be reducing your depredation, it could be still, something that doesn't change the attitude or your perceptions of having that carnivore on the landscape. Interestingly, we didn't see the same trend with wolves. And at that time, in most of our states, wolves were delisted and grizzly bears were still listed. So it could have to do more with policy decisions that are being made around the species too. We did publish this paper, and so that will also be available on the library after this talk. And I'm happy to answer more questions if you have them. All right, so again, I'm talking pretty fast so we can get to the questions, but in general, what we found is that most livestock guardian dogs, whatever breed they are, behave more similarly than different, not a surprise. However, even though they're behaving rather similarly, some are going to be more effective guardians for reducing depredation by certain predators. They do this typically by influencing the presence of carnivores, by reducing the presence of large carnivores in the area of the sheep, but also through perhaps actively defending against some of the mesocarnivores. And despite all of the positive benefits that folks have of having LGDs in their herds, they don't seem to mediate any tolerance for wolves or grizzly bears on the landscape. So, okay. So the second project I did, we just wrapped up really recently, in fact. And this is that in parts of, this was brought up from Montana Fish Wildlife Park Service, where they're just they have several bear biologists that are spending their entire summers trying to keep bears out of people's backyards. So I don't know if you've seen a grizzly bear or experienced this yourself, but that would be pretty scary. We had, for instance, one farmstead owner came home, parked his car in the garage, and realized there was a 600-pound bear in the garage with him when he got out of his car. So this can obviously be a huge human safety issue, especially, you live on a farmstead, your kids play outside. The grizzly bears are attracted to the grains, and this is, these farmsteads, a lot of times these grain silos are pretty close to the house. And there's a lot of spillage that can happen. In some cases, the grizzly bears will rip the doors off the silos, although now they have better grizzly bear proof type, very heavy doors. But the spillage is just something that's going to happen. And no matter the best efforts to clean it up, as you can see here, you can see bear tracks going right through it, a big fat bear walking through at night. So they wanted to know, what can we do? They were doing electric fences don't work well because of the trucks needing to get in and out to get the grain, and also kids and pets and things like that. Cleanup, no matter how much they do it, there seems to always be some spillage. And they were doing things like rocket, the flare, bangers, loud noises, hazing, all of these things. And it just takes a lot of time and energy. So we were thinking of something that maybe doesn't take as much time or energy, would be a livestock guardian dog. But of course, livestock guardian dogs, as you all know, are, bred to protect it. They bond to the livestock they're protecting, and they have been bred and selected for thousands of years now to do this one job. And so would they be able to transition to protecting a place instead? And we chose livestock guardian dogs because they are so friendly still to humans. And we didn't necessarily want to just be putting out property guard dogs that might be aggressive to people on the property as well. So what we did is we did what is called a BACI or BACI study design, which is a before, after, control, and impact, which means we took measurements from these farmsteads before we started anything, and then after, and then we had half that received dogs and half that did not. And the whole time we monitored these properties. Now, it's a little challenging getting properties. Most of these farmsteads don't have livestock, so they haven't worked with livestock guardian dogs. Some farmsteads are near busy highways, and we know guardian dogs can, if they got bored or were looking for livestock, they might roam, and we didn't want, car accidents happening. So we were very selective in who got the dogs. And we also wanted people that own dogs as pets. Just because then they knew how to, take care of dogs already. There would be something for the dog maybe to bond with if it needed to bond with something else, and so forth. So we were able to place guardian dogs at 4 properties. One ended up getting 2 dogs because we were aiming for 5 properties. And then we had that paired with neighboring control sites. So a neighbor that didn't want a dog or wasn't eligible for a dog, let us still monitor at their site. At the same time, any grizzly bears we could capture during the time of the study and fit with GPS collars. We did that as well. And we ended up with data from 12 collared bears. And then of course, we monitored all these sites with at least 4 camera traps around the grain silos. All right. And so the other thing we did is we had like I said, we had GPS collars on some of the bears, 12 bears. Not, every once in a while we'd still get a bear on camera that wasn't collared, but that was the majority of the ones around these homesteads. And then we also put tracking devices on all of the livestock guardian dogs so that we could see how much time they were spending around the farmstead or homestead. versus how much time they were out wandering. And even though some of these points that look like wandering are wandering, some of these points were going on walks with the owner. So we cleaned that up for analysis, of course, once we could find out, which ones were truly just the dog doing its own thing versus which ones were the dog was actually doing the right thing and being with its owner. We also tracked the attractant available. So once a week, we'd have somebody go out and measure how much grain spillage was around the farmstead. And so that way we could see whether or not, we didn't want to say the dogs are working great if it was just the person had done a really good job of cleaning up spillage. We wanted to make sure that we knew how much attractants were on the property. And then through the camera trap data and the GPS collars and everything, we were able to analyze and look at whether or not these guardian dogs worked. Now, these pictures are really cool. Unfortunately, they're not from our study. They're somebody else that ended up with a guardian dog to protect their property. But I just put them in as examples because we often would have the bear and then the dog a little bit later. We just never got them on camera trap at the same time like these pictures did. So just full honesty there. But what we did find was really exciting, and that there were 58-fold fewer bears caught on camera traps on the farmsteads that had LGDs. And so this is a huge difference, right? We couldn't even really do anything statistically because there were so few bears ever on cameras after the LGDs became present. This is relative to before the bears were on these properties. The other thing is when we did have animals on camera, we were able to, there were little 30-second video clips. So we coded for behavior, and we found that the bears that were caught after the LGDs were present were most often, there was a huge increase in the amount of what we called uncomfortable bear behavior, which was vigilance and moving away. And so the bears that were caught on camera were typically hightailing it out of there pretty fast. All right, from the GPS collar data, so this is GPS collars on those 12 bears. What you can see on the left side of your screen, the two bars on your left side of the screen, is before LGDs went anywhere. So whether it was a control or a farm that said that got a dog, as you can see, the controls had a little bit higher visitation rates by the number of GPS locations of bears on their property. That was just coincident. But still, quite a high number. And what we see afterwards is the controls pretty much stayed the same, although they went down a little. But the treatment sites, the ones that got dogs, there were barely any GPS locations of grizzly bears on their farmsteads anymore. 87% fewer bears GPS points near the farms with LGDs. Now, we think the reason the controls might have gone down at the same time is probably related to one of two things. One, some of the 12 bears weren't on air the whole time of the study. This was over 2 summers. So it could just be some differences in bear behavior or which bear was associated near which farmstead. But more importantly, all of these controls were pretty close to the treatment farm. And in fact, some of those wandering movements were dogs at the control farmstead next door. And in at least one of those cases from the GPS data, we know there was a bear there at that time. And so we think these dogs might have been having a larger footprint than just their particular homestead or farmstead. All right, so we also did a survey with these producers, these farmstead producers that were willing to let us give them dogs. And they answered a series of, I think it was 30 questions. It was a lot of questions. And they were great. They basically, the producer perspectives, I would say, were overall very positive. We only had one that was still kind of on the fence about it at the end, in that he liked what it was doing for protecting from the grizzly bears. His dog also, I should say, was the one that wandered the most. And so he just talked about how they are a lot of effort, more than the other people that got dogs said. And what we did when they'd wander is we would put up an electric fence. So this one, we put up an electric fence around the farmstead just for a short period of time to train the dog to stay more close to home. And then we could remove that fence once we saw the behaviors we wanted to see. So one of those virtual electric fences. Anyway, but the producers said in general in the survey that they considered LGDs effective an effective bear deterrent. They had positive experiences with their LGDs, and they all said they would recommend LGD to other farmstead owners. So this was great. And these are just some pictures We do have permission to use this picture of one of the kids at one of the farmsteads. Every time we'd show up, the kids were always playing with the dog. The poor dog wanted to just sleep during the day because it was working all night, but the kids didn't let that happen too often. Another farmstead, they were working on some of their tractor equipment, and everybody had brought their dogs, and the guardian dog did great just interacting with all of the other dogs, and everybody loved it. And in fact, I think a few of our control farms might have gotten dogs at the end of our study. Okay, so in conclusion, LGDs appear effective at reducing the presence of bears on farmsteads, so farms that have these attractants. And I think hopefully you might have to put on your reading glasses if you're like me, but you can see here this bear showed up on camera at 2:41 in the morning. And that dog was out there just, 20 minutes later, checking out the site and seeing what was going on. So I don't think they're doing it by necessarily being, directly interacting with the bear. Almost every night we had a bear on camera. Our producer would tell us, man, my dog was barking a lot last night. Do you guys have any bear activity? And sure enough, we'd see GPS data or camera trap data saying, yep, there was a bear there last night. So I think these dogs are pretty smart. They're going to lose in a direct tussle probably with the grizzly bear, but by just being kind of annoying, they get the bear out of there pretty fast. And again, that was just published last month. So, I'll put this in the library too, if you want to read more or learn more of the details of this study. I realized when I was getting ready and linking up to this talk that I had forgotten to put a few slides in about one other part of that first project. We did have, as I mentioned, those GPS collars on the dogs. We had GPS tags on a lot of the sheep, and we were able to look at spatial associations. And I know Ben's working on things related to roaming of livestock guardian dogs. So I just wanted to point out there is another paper that might be helpful for people that want to read about when they aren't associated with the sheep. And I'm happy to also, I'll put that on the library too. So that's all I had. I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. But obviously, I want to thank a few people, especially all of the producers and farmstead owners that were willing to be participants on research projects. I know it's really scary. This is your livelihoods. And we're like, hey, can we test some stuff? And so I really appreciate their willingness to work with us and let us be out there, at odd times and monitoring things and, using camera traps on private properties and all the craziness that goes along with that. Of course, all of the people that were helping us get dogs, my co-authors, there's others, but the two primary ones on both these projects, my collaborators were primarily Wes Sarmento and Danny Kinka. And then, of course, a lot of people with a lot of different agencies that, and I know I'm missing many more, but that this wouldn't have been possible without. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Young. We do have quite a few questions, and I think people must be thinking some of the same things that I was because I wrote down some questions and they've already asked them here. So I might have a couple more for you here if they don't come up. But the first question that we had for today, from not sure who DS is, but that's the abbreviation on here. Says it's a question about nutrition. It stands to reason that dogs that historically traveled with shepherds were likely fed alongside the shepherds during the day. They've seen some mixed opinions on carbohydrate requirements of guard dog breeds, with many people suggesting that they require a higher amount of carbohydrates. And that they've evolved to better digest grains than some of the other breeds. Do you think this has any merit, that idea of them requiring more carbohydrates?
Oh, that's a great question. Nutrition is outside my area of expertise by far. So I'm going to punt a little. We did have a lot of issues with feeding, like when to feed, where to feed. The ones especially that had like the pasture system on the Hooterite colonies, we had to make sure they were still feeding out in the pastures so the dogs didn't always want to go back to where the people live. And so they were creating like really cool feeders that kept the bears out, for instance, because they didn't want to start attracting bears. So probably similar to not attracting feral pigs in Texas, right, to the feeders. And some of these colonies created their own really cool feeding systems. But they thought a lot about when to feed, for instance, like, and I think that might even have to do with carbohydrates. Like if you're feeding at certain times, I assume dogs are similar to humans and that carbohydrates are good for us at certain times of the day, but maybe they don't need them at other times of the day. So maybe if you're feeding at night, higher carbohydrates is better because they're going to be active and running around all night. But if you're feeding in the morning when they're about to go rest, maybe carbohydrates, maybe it's more protein to kind of recover from an active night. But I think there's a couple books that talk about feeding dogs. There was one out of Europe I have on my shelf. I don't know the title right now, but I can look for those. I'm sure they're probably already on the website for Texas A&M, but if they're not, I can make sure I share those because I know there's at least one book with a really good chapter on that.
I will throw out there to you, DS, if you go onto our YouTube channel, we had a webinar from Dr. Zoran. She's a canine nutritionist at A&M. I think it was in 2022. But she has a phenomenal one. She gets like crazy into nutrition stuff. I'd recommend probably watching that video, and I think it might be able to help answer your question there. Next up is from Maggie Malson. She says she realized the research with LGDs and sheep herds. Are there any observations or research that can be applied to cattle? Could cattle herds, which do have a lot of wolf depredation, benefit from livestock guardian dogs? Is there any research being done with cattle and livestock guardian dogs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should have mentioned that we actually chose breeds that are working actively in their countries with cattle as well as sheep because we wanted that option in the end. We were unable to extend our research to both. We already had it's messy. Ecology research is messy enough, and we didn't want to add another variable that we, have some with cows and some with sheep. I do know people that are trying. Oh, who's trying? I know that there was some work done in Wisconsin probably a decade ago on pastures with cattle. In open allotments, we've talked about it a lot. I'm not doing anything currently, but I feel like there was somebody that was trying to do something recently, but I can't remember who. If I remember who, I'll point it out. But I think they can work with cattle. The problem with a lot of our cattle in Western open allotments is that the cattle aren't necessarily clustered. And so that's going to just reduce the efficacy of the dogs if they're having to go between cows. But in areas where you might cluster your cattle better, they would work just as well. And that's what's happening in Europe. Their transhumance system in Europe, they're still clustering their cows, just like you saw the sheep map. They're doing the same thing. And so all of those breeds are working great with cattle.
Good to know. Thank you, Doctor. I will say, if you're looking for something, Dan Macon out in California did a research project, just kind of a case study thing a year and a half ago, on bonding dogs with cattle. And then we're also going to be doing a bonding project in 2025, bonding dogs to cattle. So look for some of that information to come out sometime soon as well. Next up, from Patricia, this was one of the questions that I was going to ask you. Do you have any hypothesis as why the white dogs are not as effective? She's noticed that people in her area have not been preserving breeds. There's a lot of crossbreeding and stuff, and she wants to know if this could account for some of the loss of efficacy on these dogs.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that, like I said, that's what started that first project is a lot of ranchers in these 5 states saying these dogs aren't working as well anymore. And so I don't know if it's, we didn't look at that directly. I think my hypothesis is one of a few things. It's hybridization and maybe not always selecting the best 2 breeds to put together. It could be inbreeding. We brought in a lot of breeds back in the 80s, 90s, and then a lot of the dogs for a while only came from those dogs. And so it could just bringing in new genetic diversity would help. Just like, you see like golden retrievers in the US don't live as long anymore. And they're attributing that to because there's so few lineages now left. So, these are just hypotheses. And 3 is it could be a size thing. Again, these breeds that we brought in were a little bit larger. They're also more ancient. They've been working with wolves for longer than, the breeds that were more commonly used in the US. So it could be any of those things. So I can't unfortunately attribute it to which one. It could be a combination. It could be these aren't mutually exclusive, and it could be a combination of all of those things.
Well, thank you for that. Next question from Daniel Holland. how is onboarding for getting the ranchers their first livestock guardian dog? And wants to know if you notice anything about retention versus folks who stop having some of the dogs.
Yeah, yeah. Most of the people we worked with had already had dogs at some point. They just might have had a herd that they didn't have dogs with, so we could place these three dogs. So onboarding went really smooth in those. There were a few people that had never had livestock guardian dogs, and so we had to work with them a lot more visits, a lot more discussions, a lot more pinning with their livestock, because even the sheep responded a little differently because they'd only been around border collies. And so it worked in. I think there were one or two dogs that sometimes we just have to move a dog to a different place because it didn't work for a dog with like their other with their sheep, or there was something going on with two of the dogs not getting along or something. So every once in a while we did move a few, but I would say 85 to 90% it worked great. We had one dog get severely injured and couldn't keep up through walking so many miles. And so that dog ended up being, we had two dogs like that. One ended up being Danny Kinka's pet dog, and then, the PhD student, and another one went to a very small farmstead where it didn't have to walk, 10 to 20 miles a day. So.
Next question from Daniel Nayeri. Hopefully I said that right. Did you find any depredation experience, numbers of events moderated the negative experience of ranchers with bears? Says, touching on the slide, you reported people with longer experiences of owning guard dogs had more negative attitudes towards the bears.
I'm sorry, I missed the first. I guess I didn't quite understand the first part.
Did you find if depredation experience moderated the negative experience of ranchers
Oh.
with bears?
Yeah. It wasn't directly linked. I mean, it could have been just a weak enough. Statistically, it didn't link. But that probably explains why somebody living around bears longer might have more, decreased tolerance. Because just over time, accumulatively, they've had more depredation, but we could not find a statistical link for that.
Okay, the next question up from Royce Siebman. How do you keep the livestock guardian dogs fed if the livestock are away from the farmstead and there's not someone to with the livestock daily?
Yeah. So like I said, some of our colonies where they had these pastures away from where they live set up these automatic feeder systems, and they would set up like gates. So, the dog collar was the only thing that could open the gate or open the feeder because they were concerned about attracting bears or other things to the area, and that would, defeat the purpose. I mean, we encouraged all of our producers to make sure they got eyes on dogs every single day, even if they weren't out there with them, just because if something happened, you don't want to, you lose a lot of money if it's 4 days before you realize your dog got bit by a rattlesnake, for instance. So just eyes on dogs every day, I think, is really important. But yeah, having a system, and in some of these cases, having a remote feeding system actually help, because for instance, at one of the colonies, the dogs like to walk the kids to school every morning. And which is, also a period of time where sheep can be vulnerable to predators are still active. And so we were trying to stop that from happening. So we were like, okay, feed them out there then, because they'd feed them, the dogs would walk the kids to school, and then they'd go out to the sheep. And we're like, okay, we got to stop that. So, so I think there's some advantages to feeding away instead of feeding at, a place, feeding them with the livestock will help.
Another question from Daniel Holland. Is there a ratio you found for the number of guard dogs to livestock or to an area to achieve these results? How many did a stakeholder need to have to be effective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we debated a lot as to whether that should be one of our primary questions with that first project. We chose not to, because again, we just could only control so many variables. So each person got 3 dogs. Now, interestingly, every once in a while, some of our ranchers, we'd go out to somewhere and we'd be like, wait, what are these there's our 3 dogs, and there's like 2 more guard dogs. And we're like, what's going on? And they're like, oh, well, we know there's a lot of wolves in this area. So we dogged up, basically. Like we just dumped more dogs in there. And there was a slight relationship. It ended up depending on, what statistical method you use, being slight non-significant or barely significant. So we probably, it's probably not real, but that they actually had more depredation. The problem with that is we don't know if it was more depredation because they were in an area with more predators or because the dogs started to distract each other by having too many. And so there is a real concern with too many dogs in a group of sheep. But the ideal number, that question gets asked all the time, and I really want to answer it, and I don't. I can't tell you. I mean, we did 3 per herd, and those herds ranged from 500 to 3,000 sheep. So,
I get that question a lot too. And I see the same thing of you can't have too many dogs. So don't go out and buy, 20 dogs because yeah, it's going to be a nightmare.
I think Van Bommel, there's a paper by Van Bommel, I think that's her last name, out of
Yep.
Australia, where she might have looked at some relationships between dog numbers.
Yeah, she's another good resource. Um, oh, next question up from Candace Jagel. What's the general size of the farmsteads?
Oh yeah, these farmsteads, they're pretty small. I mean, we were trying to keep the dog very close. So most of those data, we were looking at like 100 and we were looking at like concentric rings at 100 meters out up to about half a kilometer. Obviously the dog sometimes would roam up to 2, I think our longest roaming dog went 5 kilometers one time. So that's 3.1 miles. But most of the time these farms, I mean, the farmsteads are huge and that they're, thousands of acres probably of farmland. But what we were really trying to protect was just this area of about a couple acres at most.
Um, let's see. Well, Jeff Pierce, I think we answered your question about how many dogs per herd or the farmstead already. Um,
And the farmstead, we just were really trying to do 1 dog per farmstead. So yeah.
um, Nima, did you observe any sex specific differences in guard dog behaviors?
No, we did not. And we don't know if that was true or just, numbers game. And, some of them had 2 females, 1 male, some had 1 female, 2 males. So there was so much messiness that we could have just missed some difference, but we did not see any difference. And we did spay and neuter all of our dogs.
Elizabeth, were there certain breeds better for farmsteads since they were going to be around more people and farm visitors than your typical livestock guardian dog with stock?
Yeah, we used a typical one. I mean, it was a Congal or a Congal mix that we could get from I was working with Montana Fish Wildlife Parks, and the way that their agency works is if they're paying for it, they wanted to use a livestock guardian dog breeder in Montana. They'd like their money to stay in their state. Taxpayers paid for this. So we did the best we could to get all Congals, but I think 1 or 2 might have been Congal Akbash mixes. And it wasn't necessarily, we decided we wanted to use one of the ancient breeds because we knew that, from my other research that they did better or could do better, but we weren't particular about which one. I think they all could work great.
Next question from David Fedakar. If you own a dog for a long time, let's see. I'm sure I'll worry about it getting killed by a grizzly bear, and I don't have that worry about a coyote. Maybe it's just more emotional for the grizzly.
Oh
So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty true. I mean, nobody wants to lose their guard dog either. So you have this bond. I mean, the human bond with the guard dog is real too. So maybe it is that could partially explain it too. I don't remember any of I've heard of people losing guard dogs to grizzly bears for sure. I know that's true, but I don't think any of our respondents had that direct history.
this one's from Candace. Says super information, especially for a farmsteader like herself. She's interested if you have any information on guard dogs and other dogs as predators.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I did a paper a long time ago now, when I was just starting my career, and it's on the impacts of feral and free roaming dogs on wildlife. And those effects are huge. I mean, it can be a huge problem. And so we really worked with our producers on ways that you can mitigate that in your dogs. Some people, like in Europe, there's a lot of people that use those big like tie the big piece of wood to kind of keep the dog, especially during the day, from running and things like that. So there's ways, I mean, for us, it was a lot of like discouraging that behavior, encouraging good behaviors. Some of our shepherds kept treats in their pocket. And if they told their dog no and the dog listened, just like you would your pet dog, they did a little bit of training. So.
Next question is from Chrissy Day Sheen. I have a LGD pup and she's currently kenneling the pup at night. She wants to know if she's hurting the pup by doing that or should he be roaming free at nighttime?
Oh, um, I mean, I assume the pup is still a pup, so you want to be safe. You don't want it just to get out there and get killed. If there's other guardian dogs that can be with, and it's a fairly safe area, then maybe that would be better to let it out. But if it's alone or really small, as long as it's with livestock, I think the most important thing for a pup is just to be with livestock. So hopefully you're keeping livestock in that pen at night too.
Yep, I would agree. Next question from Donald. How do you bond livestock guardian dogs to a herd of sheep or cattle, and how long does that bonding take?
Oh, that's are you guys doing that now? Looking at
We, yeah.
it?
So Donald, as far as for the sheep portion, we haven't started the cattle one. That's in 25. Basically we get pups at 8 weeks old, from directly from breeders. We don't do any breeding or anything like that at the center. And they go directly into a bonding pen, with 4 to 6 head of sheep. In that 60 by 60 pen, they're there for 1 month. Then they move to a 1 acre pen until they're 6 months old. And then at that point, the dogs and those sheep or sheep and goats move out to a training pasture. Ours are about 100 acres, which is probably too big. I would prefer something smaller, but we just haven't had money to, for fencing to shorten the pen or those training pastures down. The dogs stay in that training pasture until 10 months old, and then we send them out to cooperating producers at that point. So we will follow a very similar bonding protocol to the cattle for you. So, but anyway, hey, I can talk all day. This isn't my presentation. I appreciate Dr. Young's time. So Candy Carter wants to know, how do guard dogs do with adding new dogs to an established set of dogs or a pack of
Yeah.
dogs?
Yeah. I mean, we had to do that a couple of times, like I said, when we'd have an injured dog or something that we had to remove and we'd replace it. I mean, there's a little, pecking order time that seemed to happen, and we just we would ask the shepherd to watch it closely to make sure that, it didn't get to the point where we needed to remove an animal. I can only think of one case where we just realized that dogs were spending too much time on their pecking order. There were two dominant males that we tried to put together, not realizing they were both dominant males. And so and again, this was replacing an injured animal that wasn't working out. And we didn't realize the male we put in was, used to being the dominant one too. And that was just too much of a distraction for the herd. So we just switched it up again before it caused a problem. So.
Next question from Trisha Nikos. What are your thoughts on human interaction with guard dogs? She's heard that you shouldn't mess with them at all. And she also wants to know, is there any research or guidance on how to keep guardian dogs from impacting other farm animals?
Yeah. I mean, I think that bonding really helps. We had that with one of our farmsteads did have a little bit of livestock, and they just, kind of did the same thing, training it, just, telling the dog it's a good dog when it was behaving appropriately around their chickens and pigs, and then, reprimanding it when it wasn't, until it finally learned, what behaviors were okay and which ones weren't. And then it just realized it's part of the family that it was protecting, basically. In fact, it was interesting at that farmstead, they had a grizzly bear come in one night and kill some chickens. And it was the night it was the only night the dog slept in the house because it had just been spayed that day. So that grizzly bear was like just timing it to figure out when to go in. So, yeah, so a lot of our data points from that 13% of GPS locations still there were from that night. Anyway, but yeah, so I think, back to the question though, I think we encouraged our people to interact with the dog every day. I think, you want to be able to give them vaccines. You want to be able to get your hands on them if they get injured or if you need to give them vaccines or something like that. We only had one place where we had to discourage, and like I said, it was the one where they were walking the kids to school every day. And they said, oh, the dog wants to spend more time with the kids than the sheep. And we said, well, have the kids ignore them for a while. And they said, oh, they are. And I looked down, the dog's toenails were painted. So I was like, not enough. You have time to paint the toenails. So so, you don't want to be that extreme in how much you interact with them because they will think they're bonded to the people instead of the livestock. But I think if you do a good job of some basic commands, they should come to your name. I mean, it's interesting because I did spend a lot of time when we were setting up Project One in Europe, working with and visiting a lot of people there that are doing this and have been doing it for, way longer than anybody in America has probably been doing it. And so and it was just interesting how, I mean, to them, they're pets, just like, my pet dog is to me. And so, but they always have a human presence there too. So they don't mind that the bond's a little stronger than most Americans like to see. But I think it's important to have some sort of daily interaction or at least eyes on the dog every day, because otherwise you'll never be able to give it vaccines or help it when it gets injured.
I would completely agree. Um, Next question is from David again. Dogs like the Kangal are part of the Southern dog domestication process and are adapted to fight with wolves and naturally do not react much to jackals. Is this because the Kangal does not react? Maybe this is why the Kangal doesn't react much to the coyotes.
Oh,
I guess
yeah,
your
yeah.
thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I hadn't read that. I'll have to look into that literature on Congal jackal interactions. But yeah, I mean, there's golden jackals over in Turkey, and so I could see that if they've been trained to not respond to golden jackals, then yeah, I mean, a coyote looks a lot like a jackal.
Looks like the last question, unless anything comes up here in a minute. This is from DS again. How old were the dogs from the first study?
The first study, I mean, we brought most of them in at about, 8 weeks old whenever we could ship them. I think we had one or two older dogs come in. Again, usually when it was like we needed to replace a dog. Occasionally we could get from some breeders, a year-old dog or something. So they were more in line with the age of the other dogs the person had already gotten. But most of them, all the ones that we shipped from abroad came in as puppies. So we could get like three puppies in the same little carrier on the plane.
Um, oh, here's another question. I was just going to ask a question myself. This is from Chrissy Day Shane again. Will a livestock guardian dog protect multiple farm species, or will they only protect the herd that they are penned with?
I mean, what we saw in Europe, and like I said, the reason we chose those three breeds is because they're working with everything. In fact, in Portugal, some of the herders would walk with mixed herds even. So they'd have goat, sheep, and cattle that they were moving together every day. And these guard dogs worked with them all. I think it would be still somewhat important to bond them to whatever you want them to protect. So you might want to have them in still some sort of pinning bonding opportunity with different ones. But I mean, these dogs are pretty smart. So I think they can learn that quickly once they learn for one.
Well, I've got a question since there isn't another one posted, but if anybody has one, please feel free to post one. I guess I just want to, I'm curious because it's the work, that we're doing at the center. What was there a set protocol for your producers as far as for bonding the dogs, or was it just, whatever they kind of used in the past or
Yeah, we did not have set protocols. I mean, I think, at the time we did this, I mean, this study started in 2014, and we wanted to be really mindful that this is not a high priority for these ranchers, right? They are trying to make a living off of being a livestock producer, and the margins are thin. And so we didn't want to have to introduce a bunch of new things that was going to cost them money and time. And so we just met with each one and talked them through how they were going to do it and whether that would work or not. And, so some of them made some modifications, especially the few places that didn't have guardian dogs before, they didn't have pins set up already. So we worked with them to set up holding pins and things like that for the bonding pins. But most of them had already been doing this for so long and had other guardian dogs in other herds. A lot of these operations have like maybe 3 bands that they put out each summer. And so we were just working with one, or maybe we had two, a control and a treatment band. But so we mostly just kind of use that as a variable that we controlled for.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, folks, does anybody have any more questions? I don't want to take your opportunity away to feel free to ask them if you have any more. Well, Dr. Young, I don't see any more coming up here. Oh, if anything pops up while I'm wrapping up, I'll ask you. But again, thanks everybody for joining us today. Oh, again, I do want to thank Dr. Young very much. It was a big thing for me personally to have you come on because I know I read all your research. So thank you again for that. Also, I want to thank the Sheep and Goat Predator Board for again providing funding for my program. Our sponsors, Lone Star Tracking for GPS trackers and also Spot On Fence for any of your invisible fence needs. Our next webinar will be in November. I believe it's the 20th at 3 p.m. If you're interested in trying to find out ways that your hunters and your livestock guardian dogs can interact and how to use your hunting dogs, or excuse me, your livestock guardian dogs when, hunting season is around, I encourage you to log into that webinar that we have in November. So there'll be a link up in the next week or two for that one. So any other, well, let's see here. Here's a question real quick from Beryl Baker. Based on what you said, are you saying that American breed dogs are probably not as good as the imported ones?
Well, no, I don't want to say that. In fact, a lot of our breeders do import, dogs to increase their genetic diversity. So I think it's just making sure you're working with a really good breeder and that somebody that knows how their dogs work and where their dogs work. I know at least a couple of breeders in the US have started to either import these breeds or think more about different breeds that they could be working with to give to different producers in different parts of the country. If you've always worked with Akbash or Anatolian Shepherds or Pyrenees and they're working great for you, there is no reason to switch. Keep working with that livestock guardian dog breeder that you're working with and get those dogs. But it was just in the case of grizzly bears and wolves, these more ancient breeds seem to be better. Now, we did get them from the country of origin, but I know other people that also ordered them from, I know somebody else that ordered the Karakachans, somebody else that has Turkish Kongals, in the US. So it's not like a US versus Europe, I'm totally pro-American. But yeah, just work with your livestock guardian dog breeder and make sure that you're getting the right breed for your needs.
I'm going to ask this because two more questions, but it's the same topic here. Folks wanted to know if Anatolian Shepherds and Maremmas were in those white control breeds.
Yeah, I mean, it was everything. It was mainly, like I said, it was mostly Pyrenees or some sort of Pyrenees mix, but the mix could be Maremma, Akbash, Anatolian Shepherd. Yeah. So we heard all of them. So, and some people aren't sure, they
Yeah.
just, they knew it was crossed out, but they're not sure what.
Okay, folks, any other questions before we close out today?
Well, I
Oh,
appreciate
lots
this.
of thank yous in the chat to you,
Oh,
Doctor.
that's kind. Yeah.
Again, like I said, I really appreciate you joining us, and would love to have you come back again and talk about some other research if you're willing to do that at some point.
Yeah. If I get back involved in guard dogs, I'd love to talk about it. But I appreciate the time. This was great. And I really liked all the questions. Those were great questions. So thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, ma'am. Well, thank you, everybody. If you have any questions or if you're interested in any of that research, Dr. Young will send that to me and I can forward those on to you. So thanks again, everybody, for logging in. Let's see here. Sorry, we just got a couple questions here. I don't have a link yet for the research, but if you're interested, Tricia, like I said, drop me an email or send one to Robert Pritz and he'll forward that on to me and I can get you that research. And let's see, will there be anything regarding livestock guarding dogs for Judy, for as far as for South Texas? I don't have any projects currently. But we are looking at doing some things as far as like, field days and workshops and stuff in that general area for you. So, let's see here. Boy, now we're getting all kinds of stuff again here. Do you have any information about how to import dogs that would be useful to folks that can afford to do that?
Um, I don't know if my contacts still are because, I did that research back in, we were importing dogs between 2014 and 2017. And so I don't know um, if any of them are or are not still doing that. But I think, um, yeah, quick there. Well, I'm trying to think who. Yeah, I'll have to think about that more and see if I can share some resources.
Okay.
I'll check and see if some of them I kept in touch with for a while, and then after COVID, it kind of became hard to keep in touch with everybody. So,
Yeah. Okay. Well, folks, I think we better wrap this up. We're already after our 4 o'clock time. So, again, if you have any questions, I just posted my email on there. Feel free to send those to me, and I can forward those on to Dr. Young, and she can get back to you directly. Again, thank you everybody for joining in. I appreciate all the attendance today and all the great questions. We'll see y'all in November. So, thank you again, everybody. Bye bye.